Welcome to the Council on Foreign Relations. Tonight is part of a series of what are, to me, are some of the most important things we do here, which is celebrate the publication of a book done by, in this case, two of our fellows. And it's a chance to give them it's an opportunity to give them a chance to talk about it and give you a chance to raise questions about it as well. Tonight's book has the provocative name of War by Other Means. You will understand the origin, and subtitle of Geoeconomics and Statecraft. The two authors, shockingly enough, are sitting next to me. Jennifer Harris, who's a senior fellow here at the Council on Foreign Relations, and Bob Blackwill, who is also a senior fellow, sits in the Henry A. Kissinger position here for U.S. foreign policy. Both have had experience in government, Bob a few decades more. And what we thought we'd do is spend a few minutes. All right, full advertising, this is the book. We'll talk about it for 20 or so minutes, then we'll open it up, and then all of you will have the, not just opportunity, but I think moral obligation to go out and buy at least one copy, and if not more. I don't know about you, in our family, Memorial Day is, and then July 4th are both major opportunities for book giving, and so you can take the pressure off yourselves by doing this. It's too early, though, for Christmas. Okay, let's start with the obvious question, and I don't know if you have a preferred sequencing, which is just to make sure we understand what we're talking about, which is when we use the word, we're all used to the phrase geopolitics. Geoeconomics, shall we say, has a more recent coinage or lineage. So when we use it, how do we understand it? I'm not gonna be referee here.
Okay, I'll go ahead on this one. Let me just say thank you for hosting us, and thank you all for all coming. It's a beautiful day out there, and we all wish we were out there.
We could move class.
I have this eerie capacity to look into your inner beings here, especially since I was here last weekend in the rain. But in any case, Geoeconomics. This book emerged from 2 years of study groups at the Council on this subject. And as Jen and I were doing the initial research, we discovered to our surprise that the word geoeconomics has been used frequently, especially since the late 1970s. Ed Luttwak, the scholar provocateur, may be the first person to write about it more or less in the way we think about it, but people used it without defining it. So we set about ourselves first for the task of, well, how are we going to define geoeconomics, and how are we going to distinguish it from economics, and how are we going to distinguish it from geopolitics? And we arrived at this definition, which is geoeconomics is the use of economic instruments for geopolitical purposes. So not for economic purposes, not trade for trade, but trade for geopolitical reasons. The book is organized around that proposition, that geoeconomics is the use of economic instruments for geopolitical purposes. And we discuss in the book who's good at it now, doing this, who's not so good at it, and why. And then, and I'll just give you a hint, Jen will speak to this in detail, but the Chinese are very good at it, and they're the premier practitioners of this discipline, with the Russians and the Gulf states and others. We Americans are not now good at it. and we reach for the military instrument, especially beginning in the period we develop at length during the Vietnam War and thereafter, and especially after 9/11. And that's anomalous because for most of our history, we were very good at it, using economic instruments, all the way from the Louisiana Purchase, where notice we didn't send an army to occupy it, we bought it, to the Marshall Plan and so forth. And we used to be very good at it, and we're not any good anymore, or not very good, and this is across administration. So that's how the book is structured, and we invite you to have a look at it.
I'm going to ask in a minute to talk about such questions about why the United States may not be as good as it was or as it could and should be. But Jen, let me ask you the question. Some of us, Bob was there at the time of the Louisiana Purchase and worked on it, but those of us.
Yeah, I was working for you.
Yeah. Okay. Touche. What are some more recent examples, either by the United States or by this, so we understand that Bob gave us the definition, use of economic tools for geopolitical purposes. What are some recent examples, be it by the Chinese, the Russians, the United States, anybody else, just so we make sure we kind of have a good feel for what we're talking about?
So first things first, I just wanted to add my thanks to Bob's, to both you and to Jim and to the council for giving us the support and the space to write this book. And be remiss if I didn't mention my research assistant, Allison Dory, and Matt Lester as part of the village that it took to write this book. But as Bob mentioned, if geoeconomics is more or less, geopolitics, but by reference to a suite of economic tools instead of the more traditional diplomatic or military tools that we think of when we think of states waging geopolitics, what does this look like? It really takes the form of everything from trade and investment to monetary policy to assistance, both economic and military. Military is probably the least interesting of the lot, only there because money's fungible. So the military assistance that we're giving to Egypt is just freeing up budget space for the Egyptians.
Economic support funds or something like that.
Right, just freeing up budget space for them. To even aspects of the cyber domain. Certainly not all of the cyber domain do we count as within the ambit of what we're concerned about. Nefarious goings-on in the nuclear reactors of Iran, that's thoroughgoingly military and not something we touch. But where we've seen countries like Russia take an opening shot in, say, the 2008 Russia-Georgia conflict by going after Georgia's banking sector first. They are venting a geopolitical disagreement through economic conduits, and so that does sort of fit within
Would economic sanctions then be a fairly common tool?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right.
That's sort of one of the 7 that we identify.
Okay. I knew that because I read the book. But I just wanted to, it's like
Can I
60
just chime
minutes.
in? It's not only one. These days, it's really the only one that the United States routinely reaches for. Sometimes with good effect, sometimes with not. We tend to sanction, as you know, many more governments than any other country on earth, but it's the one that is used, and the rest of the instruments, the ones that Jen mentioned, have fallen into disuse.
Bob, you began with the idea that several countries seem to do it better than we do it, we the United States. What are some examples where other countries have used geoeconomics successfully, and why? What do you think accounts for their success?
Okay. China, which I suppose a third of our book is about China, which over the last couple of decades has used these economic tools for geopolitical purposes most effectively. Let me say, the book we stress in the book, they don't have a perfect record and they make mistakes the way governments do. But let me give you some more specific examples to give some texture. I'll give you 3. If the Philippines acts with respect to the South China Sea in ways that Beijing doesn't like, Philippine fruits and vegetables rot on the ports of China. if Japan does something in the East China Sea that China doesn't like, Japan's exports, automobile exports to China, substantially decline. China, to do the other side, the incentive side, I think China has built something like 35 large soccer stadiums in Africa, curiously, most near the tribal homeland of the presidential leader of those countries. So there's an incentive part of this too, and we developed this at length, but I'll try to vivify it. Lee Kuan Yew put it like this, that China says to us in Singapore that all countries are created equal and need to be treated equally, but then if we do something China doesn't like, it says, you have just offended 1.15 billion Chinese. Have you noticed the size of our market? Know your place. So this is quite systematic on the part of the Chinese all around the world. The Norwegians discovered that when the leader of Norway, Prime Minister of Norway, saw the Dalai Lama, Norwegian trade with China tanked. So, and how can they do it? Well, and Jen can develop this, but they can do it because they're an autocratic government. They have no countervailing pressures on them. And so they pull a trigger and
Well, let me push back on that because I'll get ahead of myself. One of the things I was going to ask you about is U.S. vulnerability to geoeconomic pressures. We'll take China sitting on, it's the largest single non-foreign holder of American treasuries, whatever it is, 1 point something trillion worth. So technically they could do certain things, like they could either stop buying them or start selling them or whatever in a crisis. On the other hand, their own holdings would presumably lose value. Plus, they are vulnerable to a loss of access to the American market. So it seems to me that, do we not have a form of, I don't know if it's mutual assured destruction, or I guess more positively, in the old days we would have called it economic interdependence, that the Chinese in some ways are pretty needy, as well as, you know, they got to worry, if you will, about their own vulnerability as much as their ability to use this against others.
Sure. So your question is increasingly timely. As of last week or so, it became not an academic one when the Saudis threatened to do exactly what you're describing, dump U.S. Treasury bills, if indeed Congress went through with some legislation that would pin liability for 9/11 on the Saudis, as Congress did. And so then the question becomes, how credible of a threat is this? And normally, I think the conventional wisdom goes very much along the lines that you describe. This is economically irrational, therefore, because they would take heavy economic losses on the remaining value of whatever they don't dump, they wouldn't do it. That's true if you were looking at the world through the lens of economic rationality, with those interests at the fore. But if you are, Xi Jinping and the U.S. has escalated tensions around some maritime claims that you feel are first order to your national security, and you are looking for a way to underscore your displeasure with Washington, and you have, say, I don't know, $2 billion that you want to budget for this, where are you better off putting that $2 billion? In some fraction of your next aircraft carrier installment, when the U.S., even after that, will remain hyper-dominant in the military realm? Or might you want to, I don't know, short the nascent U.S. housing recovery and your holdings of Fannie and Freddie? So I do think that once you take off the lens of economic rationality and begin to look at it through a geopolitical lens, it's not so clear.
Let's talk about...
Could I just use what you asked, the mutual assured? We remember that despite the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, we worried a lot about such crises getting out of control and mutual assured destruction falling by the wayside in crisis decision making.
Right.
And so even though we thought, well, neither country was crazy enough to start a nuclear war because of mutual, we nevertheless spent thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of man and women hours worrying about it and figuring out what we would do if it broke down. And imagine that in a crisis over the South China Sea, the Chinese don't sell treasury bills. It's just that there's a backgrounder from the central bank out of China that they were considering it. What would happen to the stock market? So, and would China say, why don't we send these Americans a little signal that there are wider implications of these actions that are taken out in the South China Sea than simply the military demonstration of the fleet?
Just as an aside, where mutual assured destruction failed was in the decades in the run-up to World War I. There was the Richard Cobden and John Bright school, that economic interdependence would make war unthinkable because everyone would pay a price. People seemed more than prepared to pay the price when push came to shove. So I think you're onto something there. Let's talk about trade. I mean, right now you've got TPP sitting there. We don't know for how long. You define geoeconomics at the outset as economic tools for strategic geopolitical purposes. Wouldn't TPP qualify then? Because whatever its economic benefits, at least as important, if not more important, is strategic ties to friends and allies. And conceivably, if China were involved in phase 2 or 3, it could be a form of economic interdependence. So is TPP a geoeconomic tool that we are allowing to go unused?
It could be, and I think the U.S.'s treatment of this question of TPP as a foreign policy tool is reflective of our broader discomfort with flexing economic muscle today. And I think our basic sense, Bob, hopefully we agree, is that you see a kind of schizophrenia with the U.S.'s relationship with TPP. On the one hand, we're quite comfortable marketing TPP as a national security imperative. You saw Secretary of Defense Ash Carter come to this very building and called TPP as important to the U.S. military as an aircraft carrier. President Obama has called it an explicit referendum on U.S. leadership in Asia. Only problem is that's not the agreement that we designed. In fact, I think we'd argue that if indeed TPP were an answer to the strategic challenges that the U.S. is facing in Asia, you would have a very different agreement than the one that you have on your hands. And so it's really a matter of whether or not U.S. officials are prioritizing U.S. geopolitical interests and the design choices that they're making as they're negotiating these deals, separate and apart from when it comes time to market them after the fact. And the fact of our marketing trade as a national security imperative is not something unique to the Obama administration. This really goes back to NAFTA. You saw Colin Powell take the floor of NAFTA and sort of suggest he was going to have to raise divisions on our southern border if we didn't pass it.
Richard, could I just, to just be a moment, just one specific point. For example, I mentioned earlier, and the book develops in length, Chinese used coercively of its economic instruments virtually against every country in Asia. Well, if the TTP had a geoeconomic strategic purpose, surely you would say among the countries negotiating, what are we going to put in the TPP about this? Because we're all suffering. But the TPP was negotiated by trade experts. And so there's, of course, not a word about it. But as Jen said, after the fact, when with agreement negotiated entirely by trade experts on our side, entirely under trade criteria, when they wish to sell it to Congress, they discover a strategic purpose tacked on to the end.
And the problem is not so much that Bob and I didn't get our way on this question, that we did not build in defenses to help steel U.S. allies against the sort of geoeconomic coercion they're facing in Asia. The problem is that it wasn't even considered. I was there, sort of negotiating and sort of drafting some of the early chapters, and this didn't even cross the minds of people in the State Department, let alone.
Can I say I don't understand? So what would be, because if TPP doesn't pass, it will clearly have geopolitical consequences that are measurably adverse to the United States. But putting this, so what would be in a geoeconomic TPP that is not in the TPP we have? How would it look different?
So I think 3 quick examples. One, you want truly sort of first-in-class disciplines bringing state-owned enterprise to heel. And yes, it's true that we have a chapter in TPP on state-owned enterprises. This is the first ever named chapter on SOEs a trade agreement has ever had. But in point of fact, we have provisions in the Singapore FTA on SOEs that are every bit as strong, actually far stronger than what we've managed in TPP. And when we see the Chinese using their SOEs as the main conduit through which they're changing facts in the water, the way in which they're building islands in the South and East China Sea is through their state-owned enterprises. They've used their state-owned oil company rigs as sort of mobile territory.
So even though China's not a party to TPP at this phase, you still think we should have anticipated it and put in an SOE?
If this is about sort of building global norms for the 21st century,
because of their
that would
behavior,
be.
because we know what their behavior has
I'm trying to
been.
understand. Okay.
We don't have to guess.
I'm trying to understand.
Lots of empirical evidence.
Look, implicit then in what you both said, it could or maybe should have done that. And Bob, you basically, I think, made the argument a minute or two ago that the USTR, not just Mike Froman, all of his predecessors, they have a group of largely lawyers and trade experts, very talented. So is there something, therefore, I'm reading into what you said, but let me just guess, that you think we need an approach to formulate, in this case, trade policy, but more broadly, geoeconomic policy, where non-economic considerations or players are brought more centrally into the process? Is that a fair reading?
Yes, absolutely. And we know that when there are discussions, interagency discussions on this, those issues do not arise. And why is that? Well, there's a history to this. The Congress became anxious 2.5 decades ago that trade and American jobs was not being sufficiently defended by the foreign policy wonks at the State Department. So they created a separate entity, the trade rep, and gave that entity such superintending powers that today the State Department's influence on those negotiations is minimal, with the fear, if I can put it like this, those weaklings over in the State Department are going to trade away American jobs for some fuzzy-wuzzy geopolitical purposes. And so we've gone all the way down to the spectrum, no fuzzy-wuzziness on our part, but we're on a playing field or spectrum or whatever metaphor you want to use, in which the Chinese use 100% of the field and we use about 35%. And they understand this very well and exploit it, and we're not in the game.
Interesting. Let me ask a question I never thought I was going to ask, but I'm going to ask it. And just hear me out. It'll be my last question. You'll all be relieved to know. Then I'll open up, which is several of the candidates, in particular Mr. Trump and Mr. Sanders, have highlighted trade, and in particular their opposition to it. And Secretary of State Clinton has also come out against TPP. In their own way, I'm clearly in favor of it, but in their own way, are they practitioners of geoeconomics in what it is they're, but I'm not sure they are given your definition, but I just want to put that out there because I expect they might say yes, but I'm curious whether you think in fact they are, and if not, why not?
Well, I'll chime in here, which is rock-ribbed Republican as I am. It's this. The arguments mostly that Mr. Trump and Senator Sanders makes are trade for trade purposes. We're getting bad deals, and we need to improve the quality of our deals. With Mr. Trump in particular, it has an inverse relationship to geopolitics, because what he proposes weakens our alliances. That is to say, confronting the Japanese and saying, if you don't do what we want, we'll withdraw from the alliance. So our proposition about geoeconomics says, and we have 20 prescriptions in the penultimate chapter of the book, which says, here's what the next administration ought to do with respect to geoeconomics, but none of it is to threaten our closest allies with termination of our alliance systems on which we have depended since the end of the Second World War for promoting stability around the world. So Mr. Trump and Mr. Sanders both say we need to have better deals. Well, Jan and I don't reject better deals, but better deals at the expense, a methodology of which ruptures our relationships with our closest friends and allies is exactly the opposite of what we think geoeconomics ought to produce.
Okay, I could ask a lot more questions, but I will show uncharacteristic restraint. We have microphones, I expect, in the room, so just raise your hand. I'll call on you. If you keep it short, they keep it short, we'll get quite a few in. Sir, just let us know who you are.
Yep. Thank you, Scott Helfstein, BNY Mellon. Appreciate the work you guys have done and the time you've spent tonight. Taking into account what you said about China's success in this space, from a conceptual standpoint, is it possible for an advocate, a country that is an advocate of free trade, to put together a strategic framework that is consistent with geoeconomics that you're saying could be practiced?
Good question.
Go ahead, please.
Sure. So I think a lot of the discomfort with a more assertive brand of American geoeconomics comes from a tendency to put laissez-faire liberal economics on one end of a spectrum and sort of mercantilism on the other end of the spectrum. Richard mentioned Richard Cobden earlier. A lot, actually, to me, this is a false equivalence, and it turns on a misreading of the early economic liberals. Richard Cobden, said no free trade and cutting throats. Adam Smith also kind of looked at sort of laissez-faire economics as a theory about how to best serve national interests and national power writ large. And so their disagreements with mercantilists really turned on how, not whether, to practice geoeconomics. So I think kind of rereading our economic history as Americans today is probably step one. But absolutely, I think there's a lot of room on the table for a more assertive brand of American geoeconomics that is consistent with our values and the fact that we were founded as a nation begun as an experimental limited government. And we are going to be constrained in some of the activities in this geoeconomic space that the Chinese and the Russians are just simply less constrained in. But I think that, in fact, a lot of the things that we could put into TPP that would make it a more geoeconomic sort of savvy trade deal are things that also row in the direction of enhanced U.S. economic stability. So I mentioned SOEs earlier. Currency also comes to mind. There is a fairly robust bipartisan consensus in the Congress to include currency within the realm of trade concern. And it's also the case that China is financing a lot of its going out strategy right now, its new One Belt, One Road initiative that some of you might have heard of, through its state policy banks, which happen to be financed through its current account surplus, which is it's U.S. Treasury bills by another name. And so whether you are concerned about this question of currency on a sheer economic vein, sort of U.S. economic security, or more on the geopolitical rationale, I think both sort of lenses will get you to a really sensible position in, including currency as a trade issue.
So coming back to the question, there is a tension between, if you will, unadulterated, pure free trade and geoeconomics. You're basically saying whatever possible strategic upsides we may get through free trade, through interdependence, in many cases will be overwhelmed by other considerations, so we ought to choose to use trade as a principle, as an instrument of statecraft, even if it means we're not pure free traders. That's fine.
Yeah, but not, yes, but not the dominant unitary instrument. It's just, we plea in the book, factor the geopolitical into your policy sword trade. Not that it's dominates necessarily, but just have in the process the assurance that you're addressing these issues, addressing them. And then let's see how the interagency process and balanced out. In the last, pick a number, 30 years, that consideration, which would have been odd to George Marshall, has disappeared.
So I understand, just try to interrupt. So when we, for example, gave the original instructions for TPP, which was what, about 15 years ago now? I don't know, I lost my sense of time. There was not an NSC kind of interagency meeting saying that weighed in on it, that it was basically done simply in the, through an economic kind of.
Yeah.
Larry Summers, I think it was, called it a trade agreement with Brunei in the first instance. You know, it has grown into a different animal altogether from its early origins.
Interesting. Sure. You guys fight it out. We got one after.
Reuben Jeffrey Rockefeller. Bob, Jennifer, it's a great subject. Thanks for taking it on. The United States, we're neither a centrally planned economy nor a dictatorship, at least not yet. And in fact, when it comes to these economic matters, we couldn't be more diffuse in terms of our organizational structure. You got the USTR, you got Treasury, you got the financial market regulatory agencies, you got the Department of Energy, all this stuff. And there's economic components of just about every branch of the federal government. Are there any sort of organizational prescriptions you make in the book as to how to better kind of structure ourselves for economic diplomacy, if you will, in statecraft? We got a Defense Department, we got a Foreign Service, and they're all very structured. But on the economic side, it's so diffuse. How do you sort of bring it in so you get a more holistic approach?
Never an easy question. I could go on longer than you probably would want to hear. So let me just give you a couple of kinds of things that we could begin to move on. Absolutely. You know the inside of the Situation Room better than I do, and it's the case that I think what it means to be qualified for a lot of the jobs that sit at the intersection of economics and foreign policy tend to involve pedigrees from investment banks and a command of the financial sector, and often with that comes a set of not always, but a set of priors about the whether markets should be subjugated into a tool of foreign policy or not. So I think where you stand on any given issue in the U.S. foreign policy apparatus is a product of where you sit, and we need to create a mandate for the use of economic tools in this way.
But weren't certain people dual-hatted to be both on the National Economic Council and on the National Security Council exactly for this reason?
I mean, they are, but I think often they are coming from a background that lends itself to an expertise in finance, and that tends to mean that they gravitate towards planning the G20. I mean, there's more than enough work to be done. These people are stretched thin, but I think what gets left out are the more strategic use of sort of transactional use.
Just out of curiosity, has anyone from state or defense ever been seconded, almost like a poll ads are seconded to every joint command? Do you ever have the equivalent of a foreign policy ad or a strategic ad who would be seconded to USTR? Has that ever come up?
The transaction costs. It has happened, but it usually involves so much negotiation that it's more of a one-off, and it's not like a routine, systematic thing. But just two more quick points on this, because this is important. I think Congress also has to be brought into this. When you look at a lot of the failings of our Arab Spring policy, it's not even so much a dollars and cents issue, although that is there. When when the president first came out with his theory of the case in May 2011 on the Arab Spring, it sounded a lot like what we were calling for. It was $1 billion debt swap for Egypt. It was enterprise funds for Egypt and Tunisia, modeled after ones that had worked pretty well in the early post-Soviet days, in the early 90s. It was loan guarantees. Only problem was that when I left the State Department 3 years later, those enterprise funds had yet to cut their first checks. We as an administration were still arguing with ourselves about how to spend this $1 billion long after the Egyptian counterparts on the other side of the table had begun to rotate, meaning that facts on the ground had begun to sort of outpace the US government's ability to respond. And a lot of that came down to congressional authorization to spend the money that we already had in terms of appropriations.
Could I say one other thing about the Congress, which is just an empirical point? If you were to catalog in the last 20 years, the number of congressional hearings on security issues and the number of congressional hearings on economic instruments as a tool of American strategic purpose, they're basically none of the latter. Our Congress is preoccupied, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be, but it's almost exclusively preoccupied. How many special operators are there in Syria? And well, there are 250. Well, we want to have a hearing to make clear it should be 375. Meanwhile, next door, Jordan, a key to the future of the Middle East, an American ally, is breaking apart economically because of Syrian refugees and the enormous pressures on Jordan. And what are we helping economically to try to buttress the Jordanian regime? It's pitiful. And so you're not going to find hearings over this long period along the lines that we recommend.
So I'm just going to offer two cents there. In 1990 or 91, the United States forgave $7 billion in Egyptian debt at the beginning of the, and there were hearings. And David Welch actually was the person who handled it at the NSC. Right. And then more recently, Bob Corker, to his credit, did a whole hearing slightly different on the strategic implications of the U.S. indebtedness, and taking a long-term look about what almost, because and one of the issues that came up was whether we were making ourselves strategically vulnerable because of our dependence on inflows of money. Juan?
Thank you very much for addressing this topic. Talking about vulnerability and playing better defense, and I want to couch it in the European Union, because is that structure something that makes them more vulnerable? They have diffuse political goals and decision making, but economically there's a big group that, from afar, it looks like the Russians really take advantage of that, for example. Can you comment on that, and maybe what can be done to make that a better player defensively?
Yeah, it's a telling point, because the Ukrainian crisis vivified what has long been a suspicion of mine, that outside EU headquarters in Brussels, there is an electronic means of establishing whether the people who try to enter the building have a strategic bone in their body. And if they do, they get a mild shock if they try to enter. Because look at the package that they offered the Ukrainians, which started the series of events that caused the revolution and everything that has ensued thereafter. So the Commission seems incapable of thinking of geoeconomics the way we have argued when it deals with foreign countries. And I don't know, since Europe is now maybe the primary sick man anywhere, there's chaos many places, but Europe is sick. I'm not optimistic they're going to fix this problem. Jen?
I think a lot of it is chalked up to first principles and constitutional constraints that you see some of, to a lesser extent in the American context, that you're not going to fix with the Europeans, but they do a lot of it to themselves. There's no constitutional reason in Europe why they have they've come to a default setting around sanctions that requires them to affirmatively re-up the European side of the US-EU sanctions on Russia right now, just as one example, where that would be the kind of thing that I would hope we would prioritize in a next administration, beginning to develop an economic relationship with the EU that bears some semblance to the military relationship that we have in NATO.
We may have time for two more.
Richard, could I just say,
One more,
I like
okay.
the question, okay, but I want, we stress the need, if the next American president were to be sympathetic to these ideas, we really have to proselytize them. Not just in the Congress at home, but we have to go to our alliances and our friends who mostly don't think in this way now, and try to persuade them that this is a powerful potential instrument of alliance solidarity and purposes. After all, we have the biggest economy in the world, or the richest country in the world. We have Japan, and we go through the size of these economies. But they don't think like that, and we would have to, led by the president, and it would have to be led by the president, say, let's not just talk about the security dimensions of the U.S.-Japan alliance or NATO or whatever you want to talk about on the military side. Let's talk about how geoeconomic instruments can strengthen these relationships.
I'll take two very quick questions. John and Jen, I'm going to collect these two questions. Quick questions, quick answers, and I apologize.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador and Ms. Harris, for writing the book. John Sackwitz, KMAC Radio in Mendocino County, and speaking with Senator Feinstein and Representative Mike Thompson, both of who sit on intelligence committees, they've been thinking long and hard about the prospect of China dumping treasuries and also Saudi Arabia dumping treasuries. But their view is that it's really more of an asymmetrical comparison to a nuclear mutually assured destruction, because in the era of swaps and derivatives, you can make money shorting markets. So China or Saudi Arabia can hire Goldman Sachs and be on both sides of the trade. And in fact, Goldman Sachs was on both sides of the Greek default trade. So my question is, do you agree that there's a certain asymmetrical nature to this new era of geoeconomic warfare?
Hold your answer. Let's get Jen's last question, and then you'll give you a chance. You can choose whichever question is easier.
Thanks. So my question is, how do we protect our country from the devastating geoeconomic effects on our economy when the unprecedented money printing and debt since 2008 inevitably comes home to roost?
Related questions.
Jen.
How rare. Okay, take it away, Jen, Bob.
I think both of your questions touch on something important, which is what's new here. Certain people, other books have written about aspects, singular dimensions of what we're talking about, but the pace and the depth and the liquidity of global capital markets is acting as a force multiplier across all of these instruments. And so my short answer to your question on vulnerability and whether it's asymmetric is absolutely. And I haven't seen nearly enough thinking go into what sort of prophylactic protections we could be putting in. And I think it derives from this discomfort of even thinking in these terms, point one. And then, certainly our monetary policy has had to do some unprecedented sort of heroics, and I would call them heroics. It probably depends on which side of a political aisle you fall on this. But how this redounds to U.S. economic health, I think, is the broader question. And by several measures, you've seen U.S. deficits actually as a percentage of GDP, which to me is the more salient reference point, actually come down. So I think we are, both by virtue of what we averted in the monetary policy decisions that we took, and by some more conventional measures like deficits as a percentage of GDP in stronger terms, certainly, than we were 8 years ago.
Bob, you good? So look, let me again congratulate Ambassador Blackwell and Professor Harris. And now listen, this is an important book. It actually, I think you got in the taste for it. It takes a big idea and it really develops it. So, and it does it in a way that's accessible. If you saw the piece in Foreign Affairs, you'll know what I mean. But it's an interesting combination of conceptual work with practical and applied history. So again, I commend the authors. I thank them for it's a real important contribution to the literature, and I recommend that those of you who have not bought it do so, and if you do that, then read it, because you'll gain a lot from it. So again, thanks to you both.